This is Legal Angle with Emmanuel the Law Holowale. I have with me today a mentor, Frederick D. Benton Esquire. He's been a defense attorney for over 40 years. He has tried different kind of cases ranging from capital murder, sexual assault cases, and a lot of high profile cases. When you think of a defense attorney in Columbus, he is the lawyer that other lawyers call for help. Welcome to the show, Mr. Benton.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Can you tell the audience about Frederick D. Benton Esquire?
Well, come from Philadelphia, born and raised, diehard Eagles fan, uh, father of two children who are at least at home, so they keep me very busy. I'm an active member of the Mount Oliver Baptist Church. I certainly care about my community and try to be involved in those issues and those programs that would assist in the development of our children, particularly as it relates to children. Um, I chair the Glorious Friend Christian Academy at our church where we have grades K through 6. So if you're looking for a great school to send your children, please give us a call. Um, but I'm in private practice. My office is at 98 Hamilton Park here in Columbus. I've been in practice, as you've indicated, for well over 40 years, or slightly over 40 years. I don't say well over. I don't want to age myself. Graduated from Capitalist Law School, and I'm involved in a practice of law that I never thought that I would be involved in. To be quite honest with you, my aspirations when I was growing up was to be a doctor, and then I decided that I didn't want to see all that blood and guts, so became a lawyer. Then I saw blood and guts as a lawyer, so it kind of continued. And what inspired me to become involved with the law is the whole civil rights movement. I was very much moved and inspired by men like Thurgood Marshall, Spotswood Robinson, James Naismith, and the like, and their advocacy. And when I saw what the law could do in terms of its broader aspect and bringing about fundamental change within our community, that was something that inspired me. Now, having said that, I still said that one of the things I would not do is to practice criminal defense. I had that misconception. I did not want to get my hands dirty, as it were. But while I was in law school, I clerked for the Franklin County Public Defender's Office, and I got a taste. Got bit by the bug in that process because, again, I saw the need for an effective advocacy and the value and the need of having qualified advocates who are literally standing in between everyday citizens and the injustices that can be imposed by our criminal justice system. So I enjoy what I'm doing. Until the Lord calls me home, I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing. And hopefully, and I've certainly been blessed in the process, and I believe in blessing others.
Thank you. You've been practicing for over 40 years, and
Yes.
over these years, I'm sure there have been some changes. What are the changes you've noticed as compared to 40 years ago?
Well, you have changes on a number of fronts. First of all, in terms of what the law is, um, the kinds of problems that the law is facing, or that the law has to address itself to. We're dealing more with situations that, from my perspective, um, are issues that really should not belong within the court. You have issues with respect to mental health. You have issues with respect to substance abuse. You have issues with respect to the breakdown of the family. Now, the court inevitably will deal with it, but the reality is that those are issues that should be dealt with within the community, and the resources should be there so that they are dealt with at an earlier stage so that they do not flow over into the criminal justice system. Certainly, one of the issues that I see is stems from a breakdown in the family. And, when you're in a situation such as I am, where you're representing generations, that tends to be troubling. Where I've represented somebody, their father, their grandfather, and the youngest child. So even had cases in which parents and child are both within the same prison system. I have cases like that even now. So I mean, those are the changes I've seen on that end. The other aspect of it is, and this is obviously very broadly a very, very broad analysis. The other thing that I see is that in terms of the law itself, there has been an increasing trend in terms of minimum mandatory sentences, sentences designed to uh, stack on penalties and increase the level of punishment that has been imposed, particularly targeted towards offenses of violence, sexual assault offenses, and also children. Um, so you have that kind of paradigm that's also out there, oftentimes motivated uh, by circumstances that tend to be political in nature. Uh, Someone runs for office, one of the things that they want to champion is that they're tough on crime. And so, particularly when they talk about being tough on crime, they're talking about being tough on black people. That's not to say that blacks are criminals. No, that's not to say the majority of crime is committed by black people. But we tend to bear the brunt of those penalties and those sanctions, particularly as it relates to our young black men. And then now there's now a greater sensitivity. Now, how deep does it go and how long does it last is a matter of question, but certainly the recent events involving the murder of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor, and others have created an awakening as to the issues that have long been championed, but are now for the first time really being heard. But again, is this just a moment in time and then do we go back to our old ways, or is this a time that actually begins fundamental changes within our system? One of the things that I've been chosen to do is to sit on a committee established by the mayor that is designed to create the Civilian Review Board to look at issues with respect to police misconduct. Now, I'm not on the board, and I'm just simply on the committee to help set the parameters for that board that will ultimately come up for election in November. And so we see things like that that says that folks are now ready to make a change. But again, we have to make sure that those changes do in fact occur, that they are long lasting, and that they have a deep and profound impact in terms of affecting not only our criminal justice system, but other areas in society as well. And then I guess finally is that the law, in terms of its practice, is changing because now you see a greater reliance on technology. Um, when I went to law school, we didn't have the emphasis on computers and online access. I mean, we researched the law the old-fashioned way. You had to pull the book from the shelf and you had to look through volumes and volumes and volumes in order to try to get your answer. Now you can do that literally with the push of a button. Uh, we had to, in the past, race down to the courthouse to make sure that we met the filing deadline before that 5 o'clock hour. Now I push send and it's uploaded into the system. And as long as I do that before midnight, I'm good. Uh, and certainly because of COVID-19, we're seeing even further advances as it relates to the use of technology because now you're having hearings that are being conducted by way of live streaming, Zoom, Microsoft Team, and so many other programs that are out there. So for me, that's very exciting and very beneficial to me, particularly given the fact that I am a solo practitioner. But it does allow me to maintain an efficient and an effective practice in the representation of my clients.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, you mentioned initially that you never intended to become a criminal defense attorney, but then after clerking with the public defender's office, it changed your mind.
Yes.
Was it because of some particular cases or because of some particular defendants? What exactly moved you to change the course of your career?
It was more the reality that here was an area where I could make a difference. You stand in the gap between someone going to jail or someone going home, where you have the opportunity to speak on someone's behalf and to provide a voice that they are not otherwise able to articulate. When you see that you have the opportunity, a lot of folks have this misconception, well, a charge is filed, therefore the charge is valid. And a lot of times that is not the case. So the ability to be able to challenge a prosecutor, challenge a police officer, even challenge a judge as to what is the appropriate thing to be done are the kinds of things that whet my appetite. I'm an advocate by heart. My mother said I used to argue a lot when I was a kid, so I guess that carries on in terms of my profession. But I like the idea of standing in front of a judge, standing in front of a jury, and using my intellectual prowess to try to bring about an outcome that represents the best interests of my client.
Thank you. And you're just not a lawyer because there are lawyers and there are lawyers. You are a trial attorney, which is also a different breed of lawyers. Those are lawyers
Correct.
that actually go to court to try cases. And most of the cases that you try has to do with people's freedom on the line,
Yes.
people's lives on the line. And over the years, you've represented a lot of Blacks and Hispanics and other minorities. What is your experience, or what do you think is the impact of the justice system when it comes to minority dependents?
Well, and I could talk all day about that. There is you have a couple of things that you're wrestling with. On the one hand, you have a law that appears to have as its premise a balanced and even-handed approach because it's a law that applies to everybody. But the reality is that within our criminal justice system, there are so many areas of discretion that is exercised and how that discretion is exercised, whether it be relating to whether or not a charge is filed, whether it relates to how a charge is filed, whether it relates to the type of offer that a prosecutor might make, or even the sentence that the judge would impose. You have within those areas matters of discretion that, if you're not careful and if you watch it closely enough, you'll find that there tends to be a more disparate impact upon people of color than you would any other segments of the community. One of the prime examples, and the argument is always, well, we're applying this even-handedly across the board. But give you an example, one of the long-standing debates was with respect to this whole issue concerning crack cocaine, and the argument was is that you had more severe sanctions for crack cocaine, particularly in the federal systems, where the penalties was 100 times more than what you have for powder cocaine. Then and with that came the mandatory sentences and a whole lot of other sanctions associated with those kinds of convictions. Well, who was using the crack cocaine? Well, more often than not, it was people within the minority community because crack cocaine, because it was broken down, was a lot cheaper to acquire. You could buy that $20 bags as opposed to paying $200 for a particular quantity. Whereas powder cocaine was tended to be used more so uh, in the white affluent communities. Yet the sanctions or the penalties that were imposed upon black folks for what was essentially the same substance was greater than it was for those who in the white community or the more affluent communities. But it took Congress a long time to even one acknowledge that there was a problem, and even with judges to acknowledge there was a problem, and then to do something about the problem that took place. Yet that whole epidemic related to crack cocaine wiped out vast amounts of our community. Folks who are still in prison now for crimes relating to crack cocaine, whereas if the penalties were equal, they would be out of prison by now. And again, So along with that, you have this concept of this war on crime. So again, when it comes to our community, we're viewed as being a battleground. We're viewed as being the enemy, as it were. And so you bring in your heavy artillery, you bring in your police force at its maximum level in trying to eradicate the criminals from within our community. And no one is an advocate for crime, but you still have this perception that allows for those kinds of tactics to be employed. And so what happens? An officer sees a young black man walking down the street, automatically the thought is that he's up to something that's no good. Whereas if he were in Upper Arlington or Bethlehem or the like, and a white young kid was walking down the street, they're thinking, okay, he's coming home from the library. Those kinds of perceptions also carry over into our court systems. Jurors, when they're called to decide a case, again, they're looking at someone who's seated at my table through the lens of the media hysteria that is seen. You have, of course, every time there's an arrest, they're showing a black face and handcuffs. But the same level of publicity is not oftentimes equated when you have a white person who's charged with the same or similar kinds of offenses. Issues of credibility are oftentimes a matter of perception and identity. So if you have a jury that is predominantly white, and they're there to assess the credibility of someone who doesn't look like them, they may be less inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, less inclined to view what they have to say with an open mind, as opposed to someone who's of the same color or of the same background with them. So those are just a few of the examples of some of the things that I've seen during the course of my practice.
Wow, that is very deep. When you mentioned the issue of crack cocaine as compared to powdered cocaine, the same thing that also applies to even the opioid crisis.
Correct.
If the crisis that we have right now is predominantly in Black community, I don't know, maybe we'll be having the kind of conversations and empathy that we now have for addicts. So if it's in the Black community, it's a crime. But if it's in the dominant culture, then it's a sickness. And
Yeah,
that also bleeds into the justice system and with judges, jurors, and prosecutors.
you're exactly right, because again, it's ironic in that when you have people of color discuss the matter, they readily see the disparity. Those who are not, they have to be convinced. For example, I remember watching a newscast, and they were talking about this very issue, and the question was raised by one of the Black newscasters. Well, where was this same empathy, this level of concern or focus or emphasis for treatment when it was crack cocaine? Well, the difference is that now it was impacting a far larger community. It was now affecting the judge's child or the legislator's son or the police officer's neighbor. So now it's not an issue that needs to be addressed by virtue of mandatory imprisonment. It's an issue that needs to be addressed by virtue of treatment. I'm not mad at them for that, but I'm just saying let's broaden the conversation and look at those other areas where a similar approach needs to be taken.
Thank you. Yeah. Have you ever had a situation where you have a defendant that shouldn't have been charged with a crime in the first place?
Yes, yes, and what it again that goes to the discretion, that goes to the diversion, where you have the situation where somebody's either the officer says, "Look, I'm just let you go home and let it go at that," or you have a situation where a case is prosecuted. Not only that it should not be prosecuted, but also it should not be prosecuted at that level. If anything, maybe it might have been more understandable if it was charged as a misdemeanor, but it's now being charged as a felon. Yes, I have seen those situations happen.
Then how do you handle a situation where they shouldn't have been charged in the first place, or maybe they didn't even commit the crime, and then they went to trial, and because of how the system is, still get convicted. Have you had a situation like that? If you did, how did you handle it?
Well, the situations that I've had did not result in a conviction. What had happened was is that the prosecutors have come and as opposed to just saying, "Look, we made a mistake," um, or we taking a second look at this. They'll try to make an offer for a lesser offense. Okay, we won't insist on a felony conviction, but we'll have your client plead to a misdemeanor. And you have to, of course, follow the client's wishes, and you have to communicate to the client the offer that's made. But I oftentimes will make it clear to my client, of course, it's your decision, but I would not recommend that you take that offer. And in one case that comes to mind in particular, the offer was made, and they had. I told them we weren't going to plead; we were going to go to trial. And I'm, they understand if I say I'm going to go to trial, then I'm going to go to trial. I'm not afraid of standing in front of a jury and making my case. And then what happens is that there are these series of offers that are made, and again, you stay resolute. Now, sometimes the client will say, "Look, I don't want to take that chance." But to the extent that a client is willing to stand with me and allow me to make that advocacy, I've had situations where they offer dismissal for payment of court costs. And I said, no, you either dismiss it altogether, and they refused to do so. And in that case, it was because of the fact that they were trying to protect the police officer. We went to trial, we got an acquittal. I've had that happen on frequent occasions. So it is out there, and again, you should never, in my view, it's unethical to put someone in jeopardy when you know that you don't have a case against them.
Yes. And I do agree with you. I had a situation like that too a few years ago where my client was charged with a sex crime, no evidence, nothing really. Even the judge himself came on, called during status conference, told the prosecutors, you guys, you don't have a case. You either dismiss this case or whatnot. You guys, do you still want to proceed? So they made an offer. I told my client what it was, and I told him, you know what, this is it. I don't think you should take it because this is not fair. I don't believe you did it. There's no evidence or whatnot. But the reality is that the client was so scared
Right, right,
that if I go to trial and I get convicted, I'm looking at because they wanted to plead it down just to have him plead to something.
right.
Eventually, he took the deal. No jail term, nothing, but still, it's his record. So you have these disparities where once you get charged, they need to tag you with something,
Right, right.
even if you didn't do anything.
There's a case that comes to mind. It wasn't my case, but a friend of mine, and I forgot what the charge was, but it was clear that this young man had not committed the crimes. A young black man. They went and again, the officers were pushing the charge. The prosecutors were afraid to stand up to the officers. The case went to trial. The young man was acquitted. When the jury came back with a verdict, the judge and the jury apologized to him that he had to go through such an ordeal.
Yeah, it's so sad. What do you think is responsible for these disparities?
Well, it's rarely a situation where someone is saying, someone, that being a prosecutor or a police officer, or even a judge, is saying that um, they're trying to be unfair or they're trying to be racist. And in some instances, I would even allow the benefit of the doubt to say that they are trying to be fair. But the problem is that fairness is like beauty; it's in the eyes of the beholder. And if you don't see the impact of what you're doing and what it is that you're requiring to be done, um, that creates a problem. When you lack the ability to be empathetic, when you are locked into a framework solely because of who's bringing the charge or who's making the accusation, because you're concerned about your statistics or you're concerned about what your superiors are going to say as to a decision that you have to make, or you're afraid of going to your superior and saying this should be the outcome, that's where the problem oftentimes comes in.
And I think race also play a lot in how these decisions are made. Because the example of what I just gave, the client is black, the everyone else was white,
Mhm.
so he thought he had no chance.
Right.
So he figured even if I go before a jury, it's highly likely I'm not going to get a jury of my peers,
Right.
and I'm going to get convicted anyway. So I'm going to spend 5, 6, or 7 years in jail because, and so they had to take the deal. So, what can we really do as a society to change this?
Well, first of all, tell folks you got to vote.
Hmm.
Don't come to the courthouse and complain about a judge if you didn't get out there and cast a ballot to make your voice heard. Uh, we often have this mindset that, well, I'll never have to go to court. I'll never have to stand in front of a judge. So I don't have to be concerned about voting, or certainly I don't have to be concerned about voting for judges. I can stop my ballot at a certain point in time. You've got to vote. Come down to the courthouse and see what is taking place. See for yourself. Don't just rely upon these politicians who come into the community and talk about how they run their courtroom or how they handle their cases. Come and see for yourself. Read up on the background of the judges and prosecutors and the like, and to see what their thoughts, their philosophy. Check them out on social media. Because sometimes you have a great disparity between what they say on one platform and what they say among their friends. So voting is certainly important. You also have to. I think we need to be involved in the jury process. Yes, jury service can be a hardship. It is a sacrifice, but it is a much needed sacrifice. You know as well as I do, you'll have a case in which 30, 40, 50 jurors are called, and out of that pool, you have just a handful of blacks. And then those who are there, they're sitting in the back of the courtroom, and you would have to engage in a Herculean effort to get to those jurors who are sitting way in the back. Um, but if we register to vote, that makes us eligible for jury service. We also have the opportunity when we come down there to if unless you have some dire emergency, volunteers. You'll stay committed to that process. Get involved because yeah, it may not be your son or daughter sitting at that table, but it could be. And we need to have more of us from the community involved in that process. Now, that's not to say, and I've long learned this, I don't make an assumption that simply because someone is black that they're going to vote in my favor. But I do think you have a different dialogue, a different sense when you have a black on a jury than you would if you just have an all white jury. Because what takes place in that jury room involves such a combination of dynamics whereby you have, if you had a black in the room, I think kind of maybe tones down some of the things that might be said, allows the opportunity for a different perspective to be presented, um, tends to manage, as it were, how those topics are being handled. I've even had cases where you've had a black juror in the jury room, and the whites look to them to interpret, black life, and that's a whole nother dynamic. But that's part of the process. So I do think that we need to be more of us involved in terms of that situation. And I encourage young people, get good grades, go to law school, become police officers. We this is as much a part of our system as it is anyone else's, and there's no reason that we can't come in and have a very strong influence in what takes place downtown.
Thank you. Yeah, I think when it comes to jury selection and even sitting jurors on a case, there has to be some form of cultural literacy because I don't think it's fair to always have like maybe an all black jurors to try a white person
Mhm.
or an all white jurors to try a black person
Right.
because of that cultural illiteracy. Because how can people really be jurors of jury of your peers if they have nothing in common with you. And I just don't mean color, culture, sometimes language, sometimes the way you see things.
Right. And it also goes to the perception, because if you come into an environment and you've already are perceived as having been guilty, if your credibility is already in doubt because you look different than someone else, that's a problem. That's a huge problem.
Yeah. In 2014, you represented an attorney of Hispanic origin. He also happens to be one of the top-notch criminal defense attorney and a colleague of yours. He was charged with serious sexual offenses. What was that for you to represent someone so close to you in such a high-profile case?
Very tough. I had a lot of long nights. When I was finished with that trial, I was exhausted literally for the next couple of months. It took both a physical and an emotional toll, and unfortunately, the outcome was not as we expected, but it is still in litigation. Um, but I felt that he's not the only attorney that I've represented, but I felt that certainly he was unfairly dealt with, and you had a system that was contorted to get to him, exhausting all resources to get to him, because of his history of advocacy. And that's my perspective. Certainly, that is his perspective. I still believe in his innocence, and I still believe that he was unfairly dealt with. Um, there were decisions that were being made that never before were being made. I mean, when you come into an environment, you have the expectation that, well, this is cut and dry because the precedent has already been established. But all of a sudden now this becomes different. Then you have to ask yourself why. And you have circumstances in which, um, here again, because of the view or the attitude towards the individual, you're not willing to step back, take a step back, and really evaluate the fairness or the accuracy of what it is that you're doing. So I continue. He's still my friend. He's still my partner. Still continue to pray for him. But yeah, that was a difficult task for me.
I can only imagine. And also, just last year, I think you started the representation from 2018. You represented the cop killer, the guy who killed two cops
Yes.
in the Westerville area. How was that for you? Did you get any backlash from the community?
You know, short answer to your question, yes, but not as much as what I had originally anticipated. Um, kind of fast forward when the mayor nominated me to serve on this committee to establish the Civilian Review Board, the FOP came out in strong criticism of my appointment. I remember the vice president saying, "Well, how out of all the lawyers in Columbus, criminal defense lawyers, why would the mayor choose that guy?" Uh, okay, yeah. I said, "Okay, I'm just as qualified as anybody else." But the irony of that is, as you know, in capital cases, there are two lawyers who are assigned to represent a defendant, and my co-counsel, and I was lead counsel. She was set as second chair. Is a white female. She was appointed on a parallel committee to work with uh, representatives from the mayor's office and the chief of police in evaluating police practices and customs and policies. FOP didn't say a word about her. My appointment, they came out against within 24 hours of the announcement. I mean, the ink had not even dried. Finally, somebody pointed out the disparity between their response to me and their lack of response to her. And the FOP's response was, well, We're going to be making a comment on that soon. You haven't heard a peep from them. Um, but I've had a lot of police officers who have criticized the FOP for the position that they've taken, who have supported me in my endeavor, and have said that the FOP is downright wrong. So I got maybe just one phone call where somebody raised a question as to why would I choose to do that? Well, you don't necessarily choose your clients choose you, either by reaching out to you or by virtue of their circumstances. That's my job. I'm not going. The fact that I represent someone doesn't mean that I endorse their personality or that I endorse the crime that they've committed. That's my job. And if I'm going to do my job, the last thing I want to do is to hold my head down because I cut corners and did not put forth my best effort simply because of of the offense for which they've been charged. If I ever reach that point where I think that my ability to advocate is compromised, then I simply won't take that case.
Have you ever had a situation where you had to turn down a client because of the nature of the crime?
I have. I I do not handle cases that involve child pornography. I've had cases involving child sex offenders, um, but child pornography would, if I'm going to represent the client, necessitate me looking at images that I just don't want to take a look at, that I don't want to be privy to. And so those are the kind of cases that I have refused on a consistent basis.
Okay. And some of your cases, at least, are tried in the media. How do you handle the public scrutiny, knowing that everything you say in court is possibly going to be either on the news that night or is going to be in the newspapers? How do you handle the pressure?
Well, quite honestly, it's really it's not a pressure, because once you get involved with the trial, you actually forget that the cameras are there. At least I do. It almost becomes second nature. I know reporters have a job to do, and I try to accommodate them to the extent that I can. If I believe that they're going to be fair and recording my responses and ask fair questions. And it also gives me an opportunity to have input, particularly if they come with a particular bias or perspective that I know is not accurate. Um, I'm cordial with a lot of the reporters here, and they know me, I know them, so I'm not bothered by them. Um, I make it pretty clear, however, that at certain points in time, I'm not going to be asking any questions, or I'm not going to let you go into certain areas. The case involving the Westerville police officers, we essentially said no comments until after the trial was over. And even then, I wasn't rushing to the mic, but I knew that they had a question, and I was willing to accommodate.
Yeah. And you've been doing this for over 40 years, so you've got all the confidence. Like I said, you're the lawyers that all the lawyers go to when they have a problem.
Mhm.
So, how does it feel to be the advocate for advocates?
What I look at is simply this. I've been blessed. Um, that doesn't say that I have all the money in the world or live in the biggest house or drive the most fancy cars, but I've been blessed, and being raised by a single mother, she's always advised us, admonished us, I should say, uh, that as the Bible says, to whom much is given, much is required. I'm not here by myself. I'm here because I stand on the shoulders and with the support of many around me, those who are still living and those who have yet gone on. So I have an obligation. People have helped me when I was in law school. Folks like Ruth Ross, John Waddy, Ben Espy. You know, it's you reach out to help individuals, and then you reciprocate by reaching out and helping others. So I enjoy that. It's a is something that I don't view as an intrusion. It's not something I view as a burden. I view it as the fact that I've been blessed to be in a position where I can help someone else.
Mm, thank you. And recently, as you mentioned, you were selected by the mayor to be part of the Civilian Review Board.
Well, no,
Do you think
not the Civilian Review Board. I'm part of the committee to establish the Civilian Review Board.
just set it up?
Right.
Okay. And that was stemming from the George Floyd's protest
Yes.
in the Columbus area. Do you think the Columbus Police Department is due for an overhaul or for reform?
Oh yes, yes, yes. And again, I'm not anti-police. I'm not saying that all officers are bad or anything else like that. But clearly, there are some things that need to be done within the police department that could make it better. And having the level of training as it relates to cultural sensitivity, as it relates to the use of force, as it relates to how they interact with individuals from the community, I think is vital to that whole process. There sometimes is a fallback in terms of a mindset of an us against them, and when you come into a community with that mentality, you're essentially looking for trouble. You don't have the same value of that person's life as you would your own, or as you would with individuals within your same community. So that level of militarization of the police, I think, has become problematic. And certainly after the Iraq War, I believe it was, where the government has a surplus of military equipment, they're now giving it out to area police departments, and you got all kinds of military gear that police not only should not have, but they don't need in terms of serving as law enforcement officers. Um, sometimes a thought that and a definite bias within a police department and among the officers in particular that impacts how not only how they deal with its citizenry, but even also how it deals with other police officers. I've had conversations with black police officers who have had some stories that you would be surprised to know with respect to how they've been treated and how they've been discriminated against. So yes, I mean that's a long answer to a short question, but I will conclude by saying definitely yes.
And if you've been following the news recently, if you look at the numbers of murder cases coming out of the Linden area and sometimes on the east side, what can we do as a community to stop some of this violence?
That I'm not here to say that I have an answer. I just have some thoughts. What certainly and let me kind of take a backdrop. Folks will I've heard make comments about, well, we march and protest in the streets when a police officer kills a young black man, but why aren't we marching and protesting with respect to a black on black crime? And I think there's some legitimacy to that question, but there's also a level of hypocrisy with that as well. Um, what happens is in our community, and particularly with our young black men, there is a segment that I would suggest that has become disenfranchised, um, that have viewed their life in a perspective as being the only reality that makes sense for them, so that and it's become so ingrained in some segments of our community that it's despite all the risks that are associated, it's difficult for them to view any other options. For them, it's when you have uh, thousands and thousands of dollars that you can get and you don't have to have a job, when you're carrying semi-automatic weapons, when you find that um, violence is a way of life, is a way of survival for you, um, even though in reality you're looking at that in a very small microcosm, that becomes your world, your view. And everything that you do in response to that operates out of that perspective. I am a firm believer that if there's a fundamental change to take place within our community, it's going to take our communities coming together in prayer. It's going to take our communities coming together and supporting one another and supporting our families. We can't have children raising children. We can't have folks who are not willing to engage in efforts to try to support themselves because they've lost hope. We have to provide for them meaningful opportunities to have a better way of life. And one of the things that my office is in the King Lincoln district. Yeah, and not too far from me was a corner where you had black doctors, and another corner was black lawyers, and another corner was black businessmen, all within the same community. We came together, we supported one another, we knew one another. We had that sense of community that says that, well, hey, I saw your little son Johnny on the corner doing such and such, and you can tell mom and dad, and you know that mom and dad is going to take care of that situation when the boy comes home. We don't have that anymore. We don't have that because what we've done, one, we've left the community, and then two, we've isolated ourselves in terms of our own respective organizations that we don't operate outside of those circles. Yeah, we say that we're doing something because we've given some money or because we may have supported a cause, but we need to be there. And when I say we, I'm talking about everybody. We need to be there so that young boys and young girls can reach out, they can touch somebody that they see as being successful, that gives them the hope and the aspiration that they can do likewise.
Hmm. Wow, that's a great answer. So what you're advocating is mentorship, that we need to go into this community to mentor these young boys and young women.
Yes,
Because
yes.
okay, because
And
otherwise,
it doesn't always have to be on a formal basis. You know, if you see a need, you recognize a need, respond to that need.
yeah. Because if you look at some of these victims, they themselves are victims of the generational trauma. You
Yes.
have some kid that was raised, maybe sometimes they raised themselves. Father has been locked up based on some of these things we're talking about, disparities in charges, disparities in sentencing. Mom has to raise the kid on her own, no support. Then you have the street raising kids, kids raising kids. Then all they know is violence. But if we can step in, mentor, and hopefully you believe that can make a difference.
Yes, yes. I mean, you have a cyclical effect here. Uh, a lot of times, when I before I even talk to a potential client under in certain circumstances, I have a pretty good idea what their profile is going to be. Uh, they typically are going to be between the ages of 19 to 27 in that range. May have gone through school to maybe the 10th or the 11th grade, either are not working, or if they are working, they're holding a job maybe the longest time, maybe about 6, 7 months. They have either one or two children, and oftentimes by the same woman. There are issues of drug abuse in their life. Um, and there have been some issues of violence in their life. And so, and I'm talking about going way back to juvenile. So if they and they have sometimes issues where they are replicating the same patterns that their parents have engaged in. Um, I've had cases where a client's first introduction to drugs has been by the wrong parents. I've had situations where Clients have their first uh, eyewitness of violence was where violence was perpetrated by one family member onto another family member. I've had situations where clients are raised in a household where you have generations who have never held a steady job. So they have to learn then to game the system, as it were, simply as a matter to survive, which then means that these other opportunities, as they view them, becomes much more tangible and much more viable. And that is in terms of engaging in criminal activity. I remember a case that I had in which we were dealing with a young man who was charged with a capital murder, and we were trying to convince him to uh, move in a particular direction. And so we called upon his father to assist us. Well, his father, first of all, was not his biological father. It was the father that he came to know. His father that he knew and that he loved and who loved and supported him was also in prison for murder. And his father is saying to his son, look, I can show you how to do time. Not that I can show you how to ride a bike, not that I can show you how to fix a car, or not that I can show you how to play sports. I can show you how to do time. And then, as a further level of persuasion, he went down the laundry list of other members in the family who were also in prison for murder. That was his culture, that was his environment out of which he grew. And so, if you have a child in that situation, the likelihood of success for that individual becomes that much more difficult. I'm not saying impossible, because I know of many folks who have been able to overcome that, but that's as a result of a concerted effort and focus towards a particular goal in their life.
Yeah, you're right. It's very uncommon because people will choose to become what they see
Right,
on a daily basis. If you've
right,
never seen an attorney, if you've never seen a lawyer, you don't aspire to be one. If all you see around you are people committing crimes, that's all you want to do. Even if you don't want to do that, the peer pressure around you will force you to fall in line.
right,
Hmm.
right. And
So
that's
it's
I love talking with children. At our school, the Gloria Strength Christian Academy, we have a process where we bring folks in from the community so that our children can see um, firsthand a judge without having to appear in front of a judge. Judge Crowcroft is a frequent visitor to our academy. We've had doctors, we've had lawyers, we've had accountants, we've had nurses, police officers, um, because for them to be able to touch somebody who looks like them, I think speaks volumes in terms of opening up their minds as to their possibilities. And I tell them all the time, look, if I can do it, you can do it. And you don't know which child is going to touch, but I think if you at least begin that exposure, if you begin that conversation, that sparks hopefully a light in them that they'll be able to continue to move on to greater things.
thank you. So, what has been your source of courage and strength, to handle all these difficult cases, and most of them in the public light?
My faith is in the Lord, my Savior Jesus Christ. I couldn't do it otherwise. Some folks fall on this, that, and the other, but for me to be able to trust and rely upon the Lord is what I do and what I need to do, not only in terms of my practice, my children, but my life in general. That's it for me. I don't know of any other way, and I'm not interested in any other way, assuming that there is one.
So, what can you tell maybe the young man out there or the young woman out there who is going to have a routine encounter with the police tomorrow or next week or the following week? What advice would you have for them?
Well, and two things. You know, one of the things that's come out of this George Floyd situation, and that Breonna Taylor's in the light, is when folks within the white community, they're surprised that we have these conversations with our children. they're absolutely flabbergasted as to the fact that we saw that there's a need, and to even understand that there is a need, that you have to educate your children if you in this fashion if you want them to come home alive. One of the things we did at our church, we brought in Chief, then she was Chief Jacobs, Commander Dean Strasbauer, and other police officers, the city prosecutor we brought in, the head of the public defender's office, city council. We've also had as part of that dialogue, and we talked to our young men in particular, but our students overall, as to what it is that they should do. Same thing. I'm a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. We had a similar dialogue with young men in our community in that regard. You know, first of all, that's not the time to try to argue with the police officer. You're in the wrong courtroom. You take that fight from the street into the courthouse. You keep your hands visible. You don't make any sudden movements. You don't reach for anything until that officer tells you that he needs you to reach for something. And even then, you tell the officer, I'm reaching in my pocket to get my driver's license. You're courteous. That's not the time to try to cuss the officer out. If it's at night, turn that dome light on so that he can see clearly into that car. That doesn't mean you consent to a search or you answer any questions, but you don't do anything that's going to raise suspicion or cause any challenges as far as that encounter is concerned. Because that is a heightened moment, not only for the person being stopped, but it's also a heightened moment for the officer. We've all seen circumstances in which individuals have what a routine traffic stop has turned fatal, whether it be for that individual or even for the officer. So you have to be sensitive to that level of tension on both sides of the fence. But the old saying, a little sugar goes a long way. You maintain your course, you stay calm, yes, no. 9 times out of 10, you'll be able to get out of the situation with no difficulty. You might be mad, you might be upset, but there's another form. Call me, call you, and we'll be able to take care of that for them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benton, for coming on Legal Angle with Emmanuel De La Olawale. It's been wonderful talking to you this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
This is it on Legal Angle with Emmanuel De La Olawale. Until next time, goodbye.